The silence in the mountains can be more terrifying than a cannonade, especially when you know that a predator is hiding in the fog, one that can see right through you, while you cannot see it. October 1944. One wrong step on the ledge means falling into the abyss. One miss means instant death from return fire. In this video, we will break down a case that staff officers initially considered a fabrication or a hallucination. The crew of an Su-152 self-propelled gun achieved the impossible. They stopped a column of King Tigers without using armor-piercing shells. The enemy was destroyed by a method that causes bewilderment even today. You will see how a shockwave can work like a hydraulic press, and you will learn why, after the battle, the Soviet crew looked at the result of their work not with pride, but with primal horror. Get ready. We are about to reveal the anatomy of the most unusual shot of the Second World War, where the main killing force was not gunpowder, but geometry. October 1944. The Carpathians. The air here doesn't smell of pine needles or freshness. It smells of wet basalt, burnt transmission fluid, and unwashed bodies locked in a steel box. We are standing on a narrow mountain switchback, sandwiched between a sheer cliff and a precipice, the bottom of which is invisible due to fog as thick as sour milk. The altitude is 1,500 meters above sea level. Here, engines choke from a lack of oxygen, and people go deaf from a silence that presses on the eardrums harder than an artillery barrage. This is not a fighting position. It is a geological dead end, a trap from which there are only two exits, either backward to a court-martial for disobeying orders, or forward into a steel meat grinder. The commander of the self-propelled gun, Guard Senior Lieutenant Volkov, is not looking at the map. Maps lie in the mountains. He looks at the rock looming over the road the way one looks at a load-bearing beam in a collapsing mine. There is no fear in his eyes, only the cold glint of a slide rule. Volkov is a former mining engineer. For him, war is not an epic poem, but strength of materials. Our machine is the Su-152. In regimental documents, it is listed as a tank destroyer. Soldiers call it the Beast Slayer. But here, on this cursed ledge, it is simply 45.5 tons of cast iron and steel, barely holding on to icy stones. Intelligence reported dryly and terrifyingly, a column of heavy equipment is moving toward the pass. Not Panthers, not old fours. King Tigers are coming. Tiger II, 68 tons of German technical genius. Frontal armor, 150 millimeters at a 50-degree angle. Turret, 180 millimeters. This is not a tank. It is a mobile fort, invulnerable to our standard artillery. Volkov knows the enemy's tactical and technical characteristics by heart. He knows the physics of penetration, and that physics is currently working against us. Inside the casemate of the self-propelled gun, the temperature rises to 30 degrees, despite the autumn cold outside. The ventilation cannot cope with the smell of gunpowder fumes and sweat. The crew consists of 5 people compressed into a single organism, functioning at the limit of biological capabilities. There is no room for personal space here. The driver-mechanic sits below, in the semi-darkness, feeling every vibration of the 12-cylinder diesel engine with his spine. The loader, a guy with arms as thick as pistons, prepares to wrestle shells. The weight of a 530OF 551 high-explosive fragmentation shell is 48 8/10 kilograms. Try lifting a sack of cement over your head in a cramped closet swaying over bumps. Repeat this 10 times. That is the loader's job. He has no thoughts of the motherland or victory. He has only a strained back and calluses that burst, covering the brass casings in blood. Volkov wipes the panoramic sight optics with a rag. The rag is black with oil. The situation is pure mathematics, and the equation does not balance. Our weapon is the 152mm ML-20 gun howitzer. It is a sledgehammer, a terrifying, crude sledgehammer. But to penetrate the front of a king tiger with an armor-piercing shell, we need to get within pistol range, 500, maybe 600 meters. And even then, success is not guaranteed. German Krupp steel is viscous. Shells often ricochet, flying into the sky as useless metal logs. And the German has a long-barreled 88mm cannon. Its muzzle velocity is 1,000 meters per second. It stitches through our 75mm frontal armor from 1.5 kilometers, like a hot knife through butter. To them, we are a target in a shooting gallery, a huge, clumsy, blind target. 2 armor-piercing left. The loader's voice sounds hollow, as if from a barrel. The rest are high explosive. Volkov nods. He doesn't turn around. He knows the ammunition load down to the last gram. 20 shots. 20 chances to postpone death. If we go for a direct engagement and try to play by the rules of a tank duel, we will live exactly as long as it takes a German sub-caliber shell to fly. 1.5 seconds. Maybe 2. Heroism won't help here. Self-sacrifice is meaningless. Against 68 tons of German armor, we need not courage, but a different physical quantity. Kinetic energy. Shockwave. Impulse. We are in ambush around a bend in the cliff. The road ahead of us is straight as an arrow for about 800 meters. Ideal range for the German. Deadly for us. Volkov climbs out through the commander's hatch. He doesn't take a submachine gun. He takes a goniometer. He jumps down onto the rocky ground, hard as concrete. His boots slip on the frost. He walks to the edge of the road, where the asphalt turns into a sheer cliff. The mechanic watches through the periscope and twirls a finger at his temple. Is the commander measuring a grave? Wheezes the gunner, not looking up from the sight. He's calculating the angle, the mechanic replies. He's always calculating. Volkov crawls over the stones. He touches the cold, rough basalt with his hands. He checks the density of the rock. This is not soil. This is a monolith. If you hit it with a sledgehammer, your arm will wither from the recoil. An explosion here won't dissipate into soft ground. It won't be dampened by loose earth. The energy of the explosion, trapped between stone and metal, will seek an exit. Volkov mutters something under his breath. Formulas. Force vectors. He sees the battlefield not as a landscape, but as a blueprint. Here is the vector of the German tank's movement. Here is the flight vector of our shell. If they intersect at the front plate, ricochet. 0 damage. We are corpses. Therefore, the point of intersection must be shifted. He returns to the vehicle. He radiates cold and a strange, frightening calm. Aim lower, commands Volkov. His voice is even, like the grinding of metal. How much lower, Comrade Guards Senior Lieutenant? The gunner is bewildered. There's the road there. Asphalt. I said lower. Sector of fire, the roadbed. Reference point, the crack in the rock, range 400. Target elevation angle, -2. Silence hangs in the casemate. Shooting at the ground in front of a tank is a violation of all regulations. It is a guaranteed miss. It is madness. We were taught to aim for the silhouette, under the turret, at the tracks. But to aim at the asphalt? It's basalt, Volkov says, as if answering an unspoken question. Density 2,800 kilograms per cubic meter. The shockwave reflection coefficient is almost perfect. No one understands anything, but no one argues. In this iron box, the commander's word is a law of physics. We wait. Time stretches like viscous rubber. The second hand on the watch freezes. You can only hear the gun breech cooling, making quiet, metallic clicks. And somewhere far away, around the bend of the Serpentine, the air begins to tremble. At first it is infrasound. It is felt not by the ears, but by the stomach. A low, heavy vibration that makes the wrenches strapped to the sides start to rattle. Then the sound appears. The roar of Maybach engines, the clanking of wide tracks grinding stones. They are coming. Slowly, confidently, like they own the place. They know that here, in the mountains, they have no equals. They are the top of the food chain.
King tigers. Invulnerable monsters encased in Krupp's steel.
They do not yet know that in their path stands not just a self-propelled gun, but an engineer who has decided to turn the mountains into a weapon. The shell is already in the breech. The shutter is closed with a clang resembling the sound of a coffin lid falling. Volkov looks at the second hand. The wait won't be long. Physics is about to come into its own. The commander does not write farewell letters. There is no photograph of a beloved woman or a stack of triangular envelopes in his tunic pocket. There lies a slide rule and a notebook with calculations, the pages of which are soaked in diesel fuel. While other crews pray or smoke, burning their lungs with bitter tobacco, Guard Senior Lieutenant Volkov is doing what is considered madness at the front. He studies the stones. 5 minutes before the enemy appears, he climbs out of the casemate, not to breathe fresh air. He crawls along the rocky plateau in front of our position, with a goniometer in his hands, like a surveyor building a bridge, not a suicide bomber in an ambush. The terrain here is not just a landscape. It is a complex geometric construction. The road is hewn into bedrock, hard as a diamond cutter. To the left is a sheer wall, going up hundreds of meters. To the right is a precipice. Under the tracks is basalt, high-density volcanic rock. Volkov knows, if you hit this stone with a sledgehammer, the recoil will dry out your arm to the shoulder. The stone does not absorb shock. It reflects the blow. This is the key variable in the equation the commander is solving right now, crawling on his knees over cold granite. He is looking for the ideal point, the point where the angle of incidence will equal the angle of destruction. The driver mechanic, watching the commander through the open hatch, nervously fidgets with the control levers.
His face, smeared with soot, expresses a mixture of fear and bewilderment.
He nudges the gunner with his elbow. "Is the commander measuring a grave?" he asks, nodding at the crawling Volkov. "Or looking for a softer place to fall?" The gunner spits on the floor of the fighting compartment. He's calculating angles. For him, war is in degrees and meters, not in hurrah and for the motherland. Volkov doesn't hear them. In his head, not words, but numbers sound. Density of basalt, 2,800 kilograms per cubic meter. Detonation velocity of TNT, 6,900 meters per second. If the shell hits the front armor of the Tiger, the energy will go into deforming the metal and, most likely, will dissipate in a ricochet. German steel is alloyed, viscous. It dampens the blow. But if you force the shell to work like a directed charge, using the external environment as a reflector, the commander rises from his knees.
He brushes the dirt off his breeches,
But there is no fuss in his movements. He found what he was looking for, a small protrusion of bedrock, a natural ramp located exactly in the middle of the roadbed. Distance, 380 meters. This is the line of death. Letting them closer is impossible. They'll burn us. Hitting from further away is pointless. The dispersion of shells from our ML-20 gun howitzer at such a distance turns shooting into a lottery. Volkov returns to the vehicle. He descends into the casemate, and the heavy hatch slams shut, cutting us off from the world of the living. Now we are inside a steel stomach again, where it smells of iron and waiting. "Listen to my order,"
Volkov's voice sounds dry, like the cracking of dry wood. Belay armor-piercing. Load high explosive. Set the fuse to high explosive action. Do not remove the cap. The loader freezes with the heavy slug in his hands. Comrade Commander, high explosive against tanks?
It's like throwing peas against a wall. It won't burn through the armor, just scratch the paint.
Execute, barks Volkov. Your job is to ram 48 kilograms of death into the barrel. My job is to deliver them to the address.
The gun lock clangs, swallowing the shell, then flies the casing with the propellant charge. The breech closes. Volkov presses against the panoramic sight. Now begins the most difficult part. He must force the gunner to do what isn't taught in training. Sight 04. Goniometer 3000. Aim at the road. The gunner turns the hand wheels, and the barrel of the huge cannon slowly lowers. The crosshairs of the sight slide off the imaginary silhouette of the enemy tank and rest on the gray, lifeless asphalt. Commander, I see stones. No target. Are we going to shoot at the ground?
We are going to shoot at physics, Volkov cuts him off. See the protrusion on the road. A black stripe across the asphalt.
3 meters before the turn. I see it. That is your target. Not the tank, not the track, the asphalt in front of it. The crew is silent. In this silence, you can hear the radio converter humming. Everyone understands. The commander is suggesting playing Russian roulette, where the pistol has 5 cartridges in the cylinder. Shooting under the feet of an advancing tiger means voluntarily giving up the chance to hit vulnerable zones. But Volkov sees what they do not see. He sees the distribution scheme of the blast wave. When a 152mm shell hits a hard obstacle, an instantaneous reaction occurs. If the obstacle is soft, earth, sand, clay, the shell buries itself in it, and the explosion is muffled, forming a crater. The energy goes into digging the earth. But here is basalt. The stone will not let the shell inside. It will act as an anvil. The explosion will occur on the surface.
Gases expanding at monstrous speed will strike in all directions. But below is indestructible stone. So the force vector will go along the path of least resistance. Up. Strictly up. And what will be above the epicenter of the explosion at that moment? The belly of the German tank King Tiger. Volkov mentally takes apart the German machine. Upper frontal plate, 150 millimeters. Turret, 180. Sides, 80. And the belly? Only 25 millimeters of armor steel, 2.5 centimeters. This is the thinnest, most unprotected place of any tank, its Achilles heel, which designers hide closer to the ground, hoping no one will get there. But Volkov intends to get there. He intends not to strike the forehead, where the armor is thickest, but to deliver an uppercut from below, using the energy of his own shell multiplied by the hardness of the Carpathian Mountains. This was not a shot. It was an engineering solution for dismantling a structure weighing 68 tons. Main thing is timing, mutters Volkov, not looking up from the sight. Lead for closing speed. We must place the shell not under the track, but exactly under the center of gravity. If the shell explodes under the track, the tank will simply be de-shoed. The crew will survive, the turret will turn, and an 88mm answer will turn us into burning scrap metal. We need total destruction. We need a hydrodynamic shock of such force that the welded seams of the German hull burst from overpressure. "They're coming," whispers the mechanic. The ground under the tracks of the self-propelled gun begins to tremble slightly. This is not a metaphor. The vibration is transmitted through the road wheels to the hull. Heavy German machines are going uphill, their engines roaring in low gears, spitting out black smoke. They feel like masters of the situation. They are confident in their armor. They do not know that on the road, not an ambush awaits them, but a problem in strength of materials, the solution to which will be fatal for them. Volkov puts his hand on the gunner's shoulder. His fingers grip hard, painfully. Nerves of steel. Wait for my command. I will say when to press the trigger. Not earlier, not later. A second of delay, and we are dead men. It gets hot in the casemate, but this is not heat from the engine. It is the heat of adrenaline boiling in the blood when you realize your life depends on the accuracy of a geometric construction. The morning began not with sunrise, but with the disappearance of the world. The mountains exhaled cold, wet steam, and by 6 in the morning, the Serpentine drowned in fog as thick as sour milk. Visibility dropped to 0. It wasn't just bad weather, it was operational blindness. For tankers, such fog is a shroud. Optics turn into useless glass, peripheral vision disappears, and the sense of distance begins to lie. In such conditions, war ceases to be visual and becomes auditory. We sat inside the steel belly of the Su-152, battened down tight, and listened. The air in the casemate was heavy, saturated with the smell of gun oil and cold sweat. First came the sound. It was a low, rhythmic hum that vibrated through the bottom of the hull, straight into the soles of our boots. Not the roar of an airplane, and not the whistle of a mortar shell. It was heavy, mechanical breathing. A 12-cylinder Maybach engine, 700 horsepower, fought against gravity, pushing nearly 70 tons of alloyed steel up the slope. The characteristic, incomparable clank of wide tracks was heard, each link weighing as much as a pood weight, bit into wet basalt, crushing stone into dust. Acoustics in the mountains are treacherous. Echoes bounce off rock walls, creating sound mirages. But this hum was too dense, too material. It filled the entire gorge, displacing oxygen. Volkov sat motionless, pressing his forehead against the brow pad of the panoramic sight. The eyepiece fogged up from his breath, and he methodically wiped it with rough cloth. He hadn't seen the enemy yet, but he was already calculating him. He was solving the equation of time and speed in his mind, relying only on the increasing volume of the motor and the grinding of metal. "Range!" The gunner's voice trembled, breaking into a falsetto. In the gloom of the casemate, one could see sweat glistening on his temples. "Wait," Volkov said quietly, with only his lips. "Don't twitch." The fog swirled outside, creating bizarre, deceptive shapes. The wind tore the white veil into shreds, revealing and then hiding pieces of the wet road again. And suddenly, in one of these gaps, a ghost materialized out of the white void. The lead King Tiger. It floated out of the milk slowly, frighteningly solemnly, like a battleship entering a harbor. First appeared the muzzle brake, a massive knob at the end of a long barrel of 88mm caliber. This barrel looked straight at us, like the unblinking eye of a cyclops. Then the sloped frontal armor plate emerged. Then the turret, a geometrically perfect structure created by German engineers to ricochet any shells. The tank was huge. It occupied the entire width of the road, scraping its right fender against the rock wall. "Range 400!" screamed the gunner, forgetting about the throat microphone. His hands shook on the horizontal Travers handwheels. "Frontal target! Comrade Guard Senior Lieutenant, we won't penetrate! Slope angle 50 degrees! It's a ricochet! 100% ricochet!" The gunner knew the theory. From the point of view of classical ballistics, Shooting at the front of a Tiger II from this distance was a technical absurdity. The effective thickness of the armor, taking into account rational slope angles, exceeded 200 millimeters. Our blunt-nosed armor-piercing shell would simply slide along this inclined plane, striking sparks, and go into the sky, leaving only an ugly scratch on the cemented steel. And in return, a German subcaliber shell with a muzzle velocity of 1,000 meters per second would fly in, stitching us through.
"Stop the panic!"
Volkov's voice sounded dry and hard, like the strike of a bolt.
"Who told you to shoot at the armor? Check the fuse setting. High explosive action. Target, the roadbed."
The German tank stopped. Perhaps its commander noticed something unnatural in the pile of stones ahead, where our self-propelled gun was hiding. Or the instinct of a predator worked, sensing the presence of another beast.
The huge turret began to rotate slowly. The electric drive hummed barely audibly.
The long barrel prowled from side to side, scanning the fog, trying to pierce it with its optics. It passed literally a meter above our camouflaged position. If their gunner, armed with the famous Zeiss sight, finds us now, we will turn into a mass grave with detonated ammunition before we can press the trigger. A ringing silence hung in the vehicle's casemate. The loader hugged the gun breech with both hands, as if seeking protection from the inevitable in the cold metal. The mechanic pressed himself into the seat, afraid to move his foot on the clutch pedal. We were a static target against the absolute weapon of the Wehrmacht. But the physics of fear worked against the crew. Pulse rates went off the scale, narrowing the field of vision to a narrow, pulsating tunnel. Every second of waiting seemed like an hour lived under the barrel of a pistol. The Tiger roared again.
A cloud of black, oily exhaust mixed with the virgin white fog. It jerked forward. The tracks slipped on wet stones, striking sparks, then hooked onto the rock with grousers. 68 tons of deadly mass resumed their relentless movement toward our calculated quadrant.
380,
whispered the gunner, swallowing viscous saliva with difficulty. "Wait," repeated Volkov. His tone was even, devoid of emotion, like a surgeon before an incision.
350.
The monster filled the entire sight. One could already distinguish the texture of the zimmerit, the ribbed anti-magnetic coating looking like hardened waffle batter plastered on the armor. One could see the rough welding seams. It was not just a machine, but a moving pillbox, invulnerable and ruthless. "Now," said Volkov. It was not a shout, but a statement of fact. The gunner squeezed his left eye shut. He forced himself to lower the crosshairs of the sight from the vulnerable, as it seemed to him, hull of the tank down, to the gray, wet, unremarkable surface of the road, to where death lay, to where physics was supposed to defeat metallurgy. Every fiber of the gunner's being protested. Instincts, hammered in by years of training on proving grounds, screamed, "Hit the target! Hit the silhouette!" But the commander's order and iron discipline proved stronger than the instinct of self-preservation. The crosshair froze on the asphalt, exactly 3 meters in front of the clanking tracks of the approaching behemoth. The finger smoothly took up the slack of the trigger. A breath, a heartbeat, the shot. "Target, asphalt, 3 meters in front of the track, fire!" Volkov's command sounded not like an order, but like a point-blank shot. In the cramped space of the fighting compartment, where the air had already become thick with tension, these words were supposed to trigger a mechanical reaction. But the mechanism malfunctioned. The human factor, the most unreliable part of any machine, interfered with the equation. The gunner did not press the trigger. His finger, lying on the electric trigger button, turned to stone. It was not mutiny and not cowardice. It was a deep, professional block hammered into the subcortex. Years of drill in training regiments, thousands of hours on ranges,
hundreds of pages of artillery combat regulations. All this now screamed in his head with one word: mistake. Regulations forbid shooting at the ground. It is a guaranteed undershot. It is the loss of a precious shell, the weight of which is almost half a centner, and the price is the life of the entire crew. The gunner's instinct demanded raising the barrel, aiming the crosshair at the center of the enemy mass, at the junction of the turret and hull, anywhere, but just not into the empty, dirty stone under the enemy's feet. A second. 2. Time in battle does not flow. It drips like molten lead. The tiger in the sight grew. It no longer fit in the eyepiece. One could see the long barrel of its gun quivering over bumps, seeking a victim. If the German shoots first, neither sloped armor nor prayers will save us. We will simply be smeared on the back wall of the casemate along with the breach. "Are you deaf?" Volkov's roar drowned out the hum of the German engine. "I can't, Commander! It's a miss!" screamed the gunner, turning around. His eyes were white with horror, pupils dilated to the limit. "The shell will ricochet! We won't scratch them!" Volkov didn't waste time persuading. In battle, democracy ends where the instinct of self-preservation ends. The commander yanked the gunner off the seat by the shoulder, violently throwing him toward the ammo rack. He hit his back against the shelves, but felt no pain. Adrenaline drowned out everything. Volkov himself crashed into the gunner's seat. His hands, accustomed to drawing instruments and geological hammers, gripped the traverse handwheels. His palms were wet, but his grip was iron. In the panoramic eyepiece, the world narrowed to a gray patch of asphalt and a steel shadow creeping onto it. Volkov did not see a tank. He saw a vector diagram. Mass, 68 tons. Speed, 12 kilometers per hour. Shell angle of incidence, 7 degrees. Ground meeting angle, critical. He furiously spun the vertical elevation handwheel, cranking the barrel down, even lower, biting the reticle into the stone. He needed to hit not just in front of the tank. He needed to hit a specific point where the basalt slab had a small, almost imperceptible rise. This was his calculated ramp. The King Tiger was already 300 meters away. The loader, huddled in the corner, squeezed his eyes shut and opened his mouth to equalize pressure during the shot. The mechanic gripped the levers so hard his knuckles turned white. Everyone understood. Now the commander will make a shot that contradicts all logic of war. A shot into nowhere. Volkov did not hesitate. His consciousness cleared of fear. Only physics remained. The equation was solved. It remained to put a period. And that period was a 48-kilogram high-explosive shell. "Take some physics, you bastard," he breathed out, and pressed the firing button. Impact. The Su-152 is not a tank. It is a howitzer on tracks. Upon firing, 45 tons of iron are thrown back like a toy. The breech recoils with monstrous speed, barely missing the rear wall of the casemate. The sound of the shot inside the machine is not heard. It is felt, like a hammer blow to the head. Eardrums lock instantly. The world goes deaf. A cloud of acrid gunpowder smoke bursts from the breech, filling lungs with bitterness. Dust that had lain in floor cracks for centuries flies into the air, instantly making visibility inside 0. The shell left the barrel channel at a speed of 600 meters per second. It was a blunt-nosed steel slug filled with 6 kilograms of TNT. But right now, it was not just ammunition. It was a kinetic hammer. It flew the 300 meters separating us in a fraction of a second. Time compressed into one bright dot. The crew did not see the flight. They only felt the shockwave that shook the hull of the self-propelled gun and heard ringing in their ears. But Volkov, not looking up from the sight, saw everything. The shell did not hit the tank. It hit the bedrock exactly where the engineer had calculated, 3 meters in front of the left track of the lead Tiger. By all laws of ordinary artillery, it was a miss.
The shell should have dug a crater, showered the tank with shrapnel and earth, scratched the paint, and possibly knocked off a track. But here were mountains, and here was basalt. The shell did not enter the ground. It struck a monolithic slab, the hardness of which was comparable to bunker concrete. The kinetic energy of the impact, tens of millions of joules, could not destroy the mountain. And then the law of conservation of energy worked. The shell ricocheted. It did not go into the sky. The angle of meeting was too small. Deformed, red-hot from the impact, with the fuse armed, the shell bounced off the stone at an upward angle. Like a flat stone skipped on water, only weighing nearly 50 kilograms and moving at the speed of sound. At that moment, the King Tiger continued moving by inertia. Its wide belly hung over the ricochet point. The belly is 25 millimeters of steel, a thin sheet covering the transmission and crew from mines.
No protection against heavy artillery is provided there. The shell, turned into a fireball, flew into the space between the road and the tank's bottom. The Tiger's clearance is 49 centimeters. In this narrow corridor, squeezed between indestructible basalt below and heavy steel above, the fuse triggered. 6 kilograms of TNT detonated in a confined volume. This was not just an explosion, it was a directed, cumulative effect of monstrous force. The gases had nowhere to expand. To the sides, tracks. Down, rock. There was only one way. Up. The earth under our self-propelled gun trembled. It was like a short earthquake. Through the dust and fumes, Volkov saw the nose of the German tank jerk unnaturally. The multi-ton behemoth, symbol of the Third Reich's power, lost traction with the ground for a fraction of a second. Physics took its toll. The blast wave, focused by granite, struck the belly with the force of a hydraulic press. Inside the casemate, no one breathed.
Everyone waited. Either we see the Tiger continue to crawl toward us, and then we are finished, or the engineer's calculation proves truer than Krupp armor.
"Got him!" someone screamed through the ringing in ears. It seems it was the loader who was the first to see through the periscope what happened on the road. But Volkov was silent. He looked into the eyepiece, analyzing the result. The tank was not burning. The turret did not fly off. Externally, it seemed intact. It simply stopped. Froze, rooted to the spot, in the middle of the road, blocking the path for the rest of the column. Its gun dipped nose down. The engine stalled. It was a strange picture. No fire, no smoke, no mangled metal. Just dead silence and a steel carcass frozen in an unnatural pose. But Volkov knew what happened inside. He knew what a shockwave of such force does when it strikes from below into a confined space where people are sitting.
"Load!" he commanded hoarsely, wiping sweat from his face with the shaking hand.
"High explosive! Faster! Before they wake up!" But they won't wake up. Physics takes no prisoners. The shell did not penetrate the armor. If we had hit the front plate, the German steel, alloyed with molybdenum and chromium, would have withstood it. It would have simply flattened our slug, turning it into a harmless steel pancake. But we didn't hit the steel. We hit the foundation on which the enemy stood. The shell, sliding on the basalt, exploded exactly under the geometric center of the King Tiger. At that moment, solid-state physics ended, and high-pressure gas dynamics began. 48 kilograms of metal and explosives
turned into a ball of energy clamped in a vise. Below, Carpathian rock, millions of years old. Above, the tank bottom, only 25 millimeters thick. This was not an explosion in the usual sense. It was a hydraulic shock via a gas medium.
The blast wave, reflected from the stone with a coefficient close to 1, struck vertically upward. It looked for an exit. And the exit became the belly of the German machine. 68 tons. Think about that number. That is the weight of a railway locomotive. To throw such mass into the air is impossible with ordinary means. But the laws of conservation of momentum are relentless. For a fraction of a second, gravity ceased to exist. The huge carcass of the tank tore away from the earth. It looked like a hallucination, like a glitch in reality. The multi-ton behemoth jumped in place as if stung. The tracks, taut as strings, lost contact with the road. The road wheels hung in the air, spinning by inertia. The blow struck not the track, not the side, but the very solar plexus of the structure. The 25-millimeter sheet of armor steel on the bottom was not designed for such a load vector. It buckled inward like a bubble.
The welded seams connecting the bottom to the sides burst with a dry, crackling sound resembling a rifle shot. The hull's hermetic seal was broken. Hell burst inside the fighting compartment where the crew sat. But the most terrible thing happened not to the metal, but to the people. Externally, the tank looked almost intact, except for road wheels torn to shreds and snapped torsion bars of the suspension. But inside, it turned into an acoustic death chamber. The shock wave, striking the bottom, transmitted a colossal impulse to the floor of the fighting compartment, to the seats, to the control pedals. The German driver-mechanic had his feet on the pedals. At the moment of the explosion, the bottom played upward like the membrane of a giant speaker. This blow shattered shin bones instantly, turning legs into mush. But he didn't even have time to feel pain. Next came barometric trauma, a sharp pressure jump inside the closed volume of the tank. The air, compressed by the bottom's impact, struck the eardrums, the lungs, the blood vessels of the brain. This is called severe concussion. The crew of the Tiger was not torn apart by shrapnel. Not a single piece of metal hit them. Physics killed them. The pressure differential killed them. They died without understanding what happened. The loader, holding a shell in his hands, dropped it on the floor. The commander, glued to the optics, received a blow from the eyepiece to the eye socket of such force that his skull cracked. Blood poured from the ears and noses of all 5 simultaneously. Instant loss of consciousness. Coma. Death. The tank crashed back onto the road with a roar that seemed to crack the mountains themselves. The suspension could not withstand the fall of 68 tons from a height of half a meter. Torsion bars snapped like dry macaroni. Road wheels were turned inside out. Rubber meat was torn from the rims. The left track snapped, and the heavy ribbon slid like a snake over the stones into the abyss. The Tiger settled on its belly. Now it was not a tank, it was a pillbox. A dead, immobile steel coffin blocking the only road. There was a ringing in our self-propelled gun. After a shot from a 152mm gun in the confined space of a casemate, temporary deafness sets in. We didn't hear our own voices, we read lips. But we saw. The loader, white as chalk, stuck to the vision slit. His eyes were round, full of animal, primal horror and delight. He turned to Volkov and screamed, trying to shout over the cotton in his ears. "Did you see? Commander, did you see? It jumped! Like a toad, it jumped! 60 tons, and like a frog!" He was shaking.
His hands were shaking. He couldn't clench his fists. It wasn't fear. It was shock from what he had seen. The human brain refused to believe that a piece of iron the size of a house could fly. Volkov wasn't smiling.
He was wiping the optics again. His face remained stone, like that basalt that had just helped us destroy the enemy. For him, this wasn't a miracle. It was strength of materials in action. He knew. Explosion energy decreases proportionally to the cube of the distance. But if the distance is zero and the medium is incompressible, the energy becomes absolute. "Not a toad," he said dryly, though he could barely hear his own voice. "It is a vector of force addition. An uppercut weighing 48 kilograms of TNT equivalent." He looked at the smoking carcass of the enemy. Smoke wasn't pouring from the Tiger's hatches. No one climbed out to surrender. The tank stood silently. It was the scariest silence in war. The silence inside a machine that was just alive. "The road is blocked," Volkov stated. "Now they are trapped." The second Tiger, following behind, braked sharply. Its driver saw the lead vehicle jump and crash, losing power. He saw the cloud of dust erupt from under the bottom, but he didn't see the flash of penetration. The leader's armor was intact. The German tankers fell into a stupor. Their logic failed. What could kill a King Tiger without a single hole? A mine? But sappers checked the road. Super heavy artillery? But where is the crater? They didn't understand that not only people were fighting against them. Mountains, geometry, and an engineer who knows how to calculate reflection angles were fighting against them. "Load!" Volkov's command brought the crew out of their trance. "High explosive! Into the cliff above the second one! Move it!" We didn't give them time for analysis. War is not chess where you can think over a move for hours. Here, whoever calculates faster lives. The second tank began to back up, its turret rotating feverishly, searching for the invisible enemy. But Volkov was already turning the vertical elevation hand wheel up. Now his target wasn't asphalt. His target was the cornice hanging over the serpentine. Hundreds of tons of unstable rock held up by a wing and a prayer. The mechanics of the battle changed. We stopped hunting beasts. We began bringing down their own environment upon them. The first King Tiger died standing up. It didn't burn. Its ammo didn't detonate, throwing the turret into the sky, as happens in bad movies. It simply turned from a formidable combat unit into 68 tons of useless scrap metal, blocking the only supply artery. Inside the machine reigned silence, broken only by the crackling of cooling metal. The crew was dead, killed by a pressure differential incompatible with life. From the outside, it looked like mysticism. The tank is intact, the armor virgin clean, not a single hole, but the machine is dead. For the German crews coming behind, this was more terrifying than open fire. Incomprehensible death scares most of all. The column stopped. The rear vehicles began bunching up, violating spacing. In the ether of German frequencies, which our radio man was listening to, panic began. No one understood where the shell came from. The muzzle flash wasn't visible in the thick fog. There was no tracer. They were blind. The commander of the second Tiger, following the lead, made the only possible decision in this situation: to clear the path by force. His machine roared, ejecting a pillar of black smoke. The 700 horsepower engine revved up. The second tank pressed its front plate against the stern of the first. A grinding sound was heard that made our teeth ache in the casemate. Steel rubbed against steel. Sparks rained onto the asphalt. The second Tiger tried to push the dead carcass of the leader into the abyss to free the road.
Tracks spun, tearing out chunks of pavement, but there wasn't enough traction. 136 tons of combined weight moved only half a meter.
It was the agony of mechanics.
We watched this through optics like spectators in a theater of the absurd.
"He's pushing the bastard," rasped the gunner.
"He'll push him off now, and the path is clear." "He won't push him off," Volkov answered calmly. "The force vector is wrong. He has no leverage." The commander was no longer looking at the tanks. His gaze slid higher. He looked at the cliff hanging over the road. It was Carpathian sandstone mixed with basalt inclusions. Unstable, fractured rock, weathered by rains and winds for centuries. A huge stone visor weighing hundreds of tons, held by a wing and a prayer and the force of static friction. Volkov saw in this not a landscape, but potential energy ready to turn into kinetic. "High explosive," he commanded. "High explosive ready," the loader responded. His hands shook from strain. Muscles were clogged with lactic acid. Wrestling 50-kilogram slugs in a cramped, gas-filled space is hard labor.
Sweat flooded his eyes, stinging the mucous membrane.
"Target, rock outcrop. Reference point, the crack above the second machine. Target elevation angle, +15. The gunner froze for a second. Another non-standard task. Again, not at the tank. But now he didn't argue. After the first shot, Volkov's authority became absolute. If the commander says to shoot at the moon so it falls on the Germans, the gunner will turn the handwheels all the way up. The howitzer barrel slowly crawled toward the zenith. "Ready! Fire!" The second shot was louder than the first. The echo, reflected from the canyon walls, hit the ears with doubled force. The self-propelled gun jerked in recoil again, filling lungs with a new portion of gunpowder fumes. The fan hummed strainedly, but there was little use for it. The shell went into the fog. This time we didn't see the impact point, but we heard the result. First came a dull thud, as if a hammer hit a pillow. And then the mountains spoke.
It was the sound of tearing fabric, only amplified thousands of times.
The crackling of breaking rock grew into a roar. A huge chunk of cliff, undercut by the explosion at a key stress point, separated from the main massif. Gravity, the most powerful force in the universe, entered the game. A stone avalanche crashed down. Boulders the size of a passenger car flew from a height of 20 meters. The second Tiger, at that moment, continued to spin its wheels, trying to move the first one. Its crew wasn't looking up. Tankers have limited visibility. They see the world through narrow slits of vision blocks directed horizontally. They didn't see death falling from the sky. The impact was terrible. The first boulder hit the turret roof. The roof armor of a Tiger is only 40 millimeters. It is designed for protection against aircraft machine guns and small shrapnel, but not direct hits from meteorites. The stone smashed through the steel like an eggshell. The turret was crushed into the hull. Then the main mass of the scree came down. Tons of stones and soil covered the second machine, burying it alive. Dust rose like a wall, instantly hiding everything from view. We heard only the roar of the rockfall and the grinding of crushed metal. When the dust settled a little, we saw the result of the engineering calculation. The road was no more. On the site of the second tank rose a burial mound of rubble and boulders, from under which stuck out only the bent barrel of an 88-millimeter gun, looking into the sky like a monument to human arrogance. "Done," stated Volkov. There was no joy in his voice, only a dry recording of fact. "Write it down. Target destroyed by method of structural collapse." This was no longer war. It was work at a lathe. Heavy, dirty, methodical work. We turned into a conveyor belt of death, the loader into an automatic feeder of blanks, the gunner into a press operator. Volkov into the chief engineer who knows where to apply force to destroy the system. The Germans were in shock. They were used to duels, to tactics, to maneuvering. But here there was no maneuver. They weren't being beaten by shells. They were being beaten by geography. Volkov played billiards with a 152 caliber, using the canyon walls as rails. "Third one's going," said the mechanic, looking into the periscope. The third tank in the column, seeing the fate of the first two, began to panic. It tried to back up, but on a narrow switchback covered with stones, reversing for such a behemoth is a deadly number. Tracks scraped along the edge of the precipice. One wrong jerk of the lever, and 68 tons will fly down, tumbling to the very bottom of the gorge. Volkov wiped his face with his sleeve. Light streaks remained on skin black from soot. "We won't let him leave," he said. "Load. High explosive." The air in the casemate was heavy and stale. We were suffocating. Heads spun from carbon monoxide. But stopping was impossible. The conveyor must work as long as there is raw material, and the Germans had plenty of raw material. Volkov pressed against the panoramic sight again. Now he was looking for a new fulcrum for his deadly lever. He wasn't shooting at tanks. He was destroying the environment in which they existed. He deprived them of space for maneuver, air, ground under their tracks. It was a total dismantling of reality. "Left," he commanded. "Into the scree under the road. We'll knock the ground out from under the track." Volkov's engineering genius worked without glitches. He saw the weak spot not in the armor, but in the very construction of the road. If you hit under the retaining wall of the serpentine with a high explosive shell, the roadbed will subside, and the tank will slide off by itself, obeying the laws of physics. We only had to help gravity do its job. A mechanism has its yield point. People do too. We approached this line 40 minutes after the start of the battle. In the casemate of the Su-152 self-propelled gun, hell ceased to be a metaphor and became a physical quantity, measured in degrees Celsius and milligrams of carbon monoxide per cubic meter of air. The gun recoil mechanism, the hydraulic brake dampening the monstrous energy of the shot, glowed red-hot. The paint on the breech bubbled and peeled off in rags, exposing gray metal turned blue from overheating. The fluid inside the recoil cylinders, spindle oil, was boiling. We heard this gurgling even through the roar. If the seals couldn't withstand the pressure, a jet of boiling oil would hit the gunner in the face, boiling him alive. But we continued to shoot. The fan, designed to draw out gunpowder gases, had long choked. It simply stirred the hot, poisonous jelly hanging in the casemate like thick fog. There was nothing to breathe. Throats scratched, lungs burned with fire, rainbow circles swam before eyes, the first signs of oxygen starvation. The loader, a healthy village guy who just half an hour ago wrestled shells like feathers, suddenly slumped to the floor. Without a scream, without a moan, he just switched off, like a light bulb with a burnt-out filament. He sat, leaning against the ammo rack, mouth open, face cherry-colored. Classic symptom of acute carbon monoxide poisoning. His chest heaved convulsively, trying to pump in air that wasn't there. "Drag him away," rasped Volkov. The commander's voice sounded like a file scraping rust. The mechanic tried to reach the loader, but the commander already stepped to the breach himself. Now he was both the brain and muscles of the machine. Volkov, an intellectual, an engineer, a man of formulas, grabbed the steel slug slippery with oil and soot. 48 8/10 kilograms, plus the casing. The weight is maximal for a clean and jerk. In ordinary life, in a gym,
Athletes work with this weight. Here, in a red-hot iron box, standing on a slippery floor, choking on fumes, it was beyond human capabilities. Volkov lifted the shell. Veins on his neck bulged like ropes. His spine crunched, taking the load. He rammed the shell into the maw, sent it home with a wooden rammer, threw in the casing. The breech clanged, cutting us off from eternity.
3 pieces,
he breathed out.
3 shots left.
The third, King Tiger, turned out to be smarter than the first 2. Its commander, an experienced wolf, understood what was happening. He didn't climb forward onto the graveyard of his comrades. He didn't expose his belly to the shockwave. He changed tactics. The Germans stopped around the bend of the cliff, exposing only the turret, and began methodically, with German pedantry, to work over our position with high-explosive shells. He didn't try to penetrate our armor. He blinded us.
The first explosion landed 2 meters from the left side.
Shrapnel, red-hot razors of alloyed steel, lashed against the hull. The sound was as if we were put inside a giant bell and hit with a sledgehammer. "Optics!" screamed the gunner, covering his face with his hands. The second shell exploded right on the casemate's armor plate, just above the gun mantlet. The blast wave swept away all external equipment. The radio antenna evaporated. Observation periscopes shattered into glass crumbs. The Hertz panoramic sight, our only eye, our sight, a complex optical instrument, was sheared off by a fragment like a knife. Glass and metal shards rained inside the casemate. The gunner howled, wiping blood from his lacerated forehead. We went blind. The self-propelled gun turned into a deaf, blind crypt. We heard the German reloading. We knew he would place the next shell precisely, trying to hit the embrasure or knock off a track.
"Stop the panic!" Volkov threw the gunner away from the useless hand wheels. "Hatch! Open the commander's hatch!"
It was suicide. Opening the hatch under shrapnel fire meant inviting death inside. But there was no other way. Shooting blindly meant wasting the last 3 shells for nothing. Volkov yanked the latch handle. The heavy hatch cover swung open. Cold mountain air mixed with the smell of TNT burst into the casemate, but it seemed sweet to us, like nectar. The commander stuck out of the hatch up to his shoulders. Shrapnel whistled around, striking the armor with a nasty screech. Stone crumbled from explosions. Volkov didn't duck. He looked at the barrel of our gun from above. He used the bore sighting method, the most primitive, unreliable, and ancient way of aiming, where you align the axis of the barrel bore with the target visually, without any optics.
"Right!"
he shouted down into the hatch.
"More right! Turn with the hull, mechanic!"
The driver mechanic, working the clutches, turned the entire self-propelled gun in jerks. The barrel crawled along the horizon.
"Stop! Higher! Crank the vertical!"
Volkov was now the only seeing organ of this steel organism. He saw the third Tiger, which was half hidden behind the scree. The German felt safe. He thought he had suppressed us, that we were stunned and taken out of action. He was preparing for the decisive shot. Volkov saw the black pupil of the German gun looking straight at him. It was a duel of gazes, only instead of eyes, calibers. 152 millimeters against 88. "Just a bit higher," whispered Volkov, catching the horizon line. His hands, gripping the edge of the hatch, turned white. Not from fear. They turned to stone from tension. He became part of the metal.
"Fire!"
he shouted and sharply dove down, tearing skin on the hatch latches. The shot thundered the moment the hatch cover hadn't yet managed to slam shut. The shockwave burst inside, hitting ears more painfully than before. But we paid no attention. We waited for the sound of impact. It was our last argument of kings.
If we miss, the German finishes us off within 10 seconds. We won't have time to reload. Volkov could barely stand, and the loader was out cold. The mechanic and gunner were concussed so badly that dark venous blood flowed from both their noses. We weren't heroes at that moment. We were just worn-out parts of a mechanism working at the limit of material strength. But physics, unlike biology, knows no fatigue. The shell leaving the barrel carried energy that did not depend on how much pain we were in. The shell, fired through the barrel, without precision instruments, by intuition and mathematical calculation, slammed into the rock cornice 2 meters from the track of the third Tiger. The fuse worked instantly. The high explosive action on the stone caused a shrapnel effect. Tons of sharp stone crumbs and large basalt fragments struck the side of the German machine. This did not penetrate the armor. For an 80mm side, stones are not a threat. But this became the last straw in the cup of patience of German metal and German spirit. The crew, deafened, blinded by dust, having lost visual contact with reality, wavered. In the ether, which we continued to listen to through the crackle of interference, sounded a short, hysterical command in German. Zurück! Alle zurück! Back. Everyone back. It wasn't cowardice. It was cold calculation that finally coincided with ours. The commander of the German tank company, having lost 2 brand-new machines to fire from an invisible enemy, realized the tactical dead end. The road is blocked. Mountains are falling from above. Artillery capable of flipping tanks with a shockwave is hitting from below. Continuing the offensive in such conditions means simply scrapping equipment. The retreat began. But on a narrow mountain switchback, the width of which barely exceeds the width of a King Tiger hull, reversing is a complex engineering maneuver. The driver mechanic's visibility while moving backward is practically non-existent. He is blind. His eyes are the commander, who must stick out of the hatch and correct every movement of the tracks via intercom. But sticking out was scary. The air was still saturated with stone dust and the expectation of the next shot. The third Tiger, the very one we fired the last shell at, jerked backward too sharply. The multi-disc clutch engaged roughly. The right track, clogged with mud and wet snow, lost traction with the asphalt. The tank drifted. Its stern, heavy, overloaded with engine and armor, swerved toward the precipice. The laws of statics are relentless. The machine's center of gravity shifted beyond the support area. We saw this through binoculars. Volkov, staggering, climbed out of the casemate onto the armor, holding onto the guardrail so as not to fall from dizziness. He raised his old field glasses to his eyes, the lenses of which miraculously survived. The tank didn't fall immediately. It hung there. The left track spun desperately in the air, throwing clods of mud into the abyss. The right one ground against the edge of the cliff, striking sparks, trying to catch onto solid ground. The engine roared at maximum RPMs. The driver tried to pull the machine forward, back onto the road. But the mass of 68 tons worked against him. The gravity vector pulled down stronger than the friction force and engine thrust. Slowly, frighteningly slowly, the steel giant began to slide. The grinding of metal on stone was so piercing that it drowned out even the engine noise. It seemed the mountain itself groaned in pain. The tank turret turned, as if trying to look where it was falling. The gun barrel grazed the asphalt, leaving a deep furrow. Then the edge of the road, undermined by our previous explosions, gave way. A piece of cliff broke off. The Tiger tipped over. It flipped over the side heavily and clumsily. The impact against the first rock outcrop below was dull, guttural. The turret was torn from the ring. It flew aside like a lid from a pot. The hull continued falling, tumbling, breaking trees growing on the slope like matchsticks. 5 seconds later, it disappeared into the fog of the gorge. 3 seconds after that, the sound of hitting the bottom came from below, a sound like the sigh of a huge, dying beast. And silence. The remaining tanks, seeing the death of their rearguard, accelerated their retreat. They backed away carefully, hugging the cliff, afraid to repeat the fate of the fallen one. 10 minutes later, the roar of engines died down. They left. They left on the road 2 monuments to their defeat. One dead tank rearing up, and a pile of stones under which the second was buried. Silence fell. It was not the blessed silence written about in novels. It was a vacuum, ringing emptiness. It pressed on the ears harder than a cannonade. After 40 minutes of continuous thunder, shrapnel screeching and engine roaring, the absence of sound was perceived by the brain as trauma. A thin, high-pitched squeal stood in the ears, a consequence of auditory nerve concussion. Volkov lowered the binoculars. He stood on the armor of his self-propelled gun, black from soot, with a face looking like a death mask. His hands shook. It wasn't the tremor of fear. Fear is chemistry. It passes. It was physiological muscle failure. Glycogen in muscle fibers was completely burned. The nervous system, working at the limit of excitation, collapsed into a pit of exhaustion. He tried to smoke, took out a cigarette, but couldn't bring the match to it. His fingers simply didn't obey brain commands. The match broke. The second one fell out. He spat and simply sat on the cold armor, dangling his legs into the open hatch. Inside the machine, someone coughed. The sound was wet, heavy. "Alive?" asked Volkov, not turning around. His voice was alien, husky. "Alive, Comrade Commander," came from below. The driver mechanic crawled out, greedily gulping air with his mouth like a fish thrown onto shore. A black stream of blood mixed with snot and soot trailed from his nose. "Only Vaska, the loader, haven't come to yet." "He'll come to," Volkov said indifferently. "There's oxygen, means he'll live." He looked at the road, at the result of his work. 3 tanks. A regiment of heavy German equipment stopped by 1 machine and 4 people. Without armor-piercing shells, without infantry support, without aviation. Only physics, geometry, and precise calculation of vectors. Below, in the gorge, dust was still settling. It smelled of sulfur and red-hot stone. Volkov felt no pride. He felt emptiness, as if his frame had been taken out and he turned into a bag of bones. He looked at his hands. They were black, in oil and abrasions. Knuckles on his right hand were skinned to blood, apparently hit the breech during loading. He didn't even feel the pain. Pain will come later, when adrenaline leaves completely. And now there was only heaviness. The heaviness of victory, which weighs more than defeat. "Stand down, combat alert," he said into the void. "Kill the engine." The diesel sneezed and fell silent. Now the silence became absolute. Only the wind whistled in the holes left by shrapnel on the casemate, and cooling metal crackled, contracting. This sound, tsk-tsk, was the only metronome counting the time of the new life we just won for ourselves from death and strength of materials. We won this engineering dispute, but the price was high. I looked at the mechanic's face. He was 20 years old, but now he looked 40. War aged us not by years, but by G-forces. "Hey, Commander," the mechanic asked quietly. "Is it true you got them with mathematics?" Volkov looked at him with a cloudy gaze. "Not mathematics," he answered. Geometry of explosion. Go, splash some water on Vaska. We still have to tighten the tracks. The workday ended. The work night began. War is, first of all, work. Heavy, dirty, endless work. Regimental headquarters was located in the basement of a ruined Austrian hotel. Here it didn't smell of pine and gunpowder like on the pass, but of sour cabbage soup, cheap tobacco, and wet greatcoats. The air was stale, heavy, smoked to blueness. Kerosene lamps smoked, casting long, jerky shadows of staff officers bending over maps onto the walls. Guards, Senior Lieutenant Volkov, stood before the brigade commander's table, feeling like an alien element in this clerical bustle. He was still there, in the mountains. A continuous, high-pitched ringing stood in his ears, consequences of auditory nerve concussion, which even cotton plugs couldn't stifle. The face of the self-propelled gun commander was gray from stone dust eaten into pores, eyes sunken, and hands lying on the seams of his breeches trembled slightly, betraying extreme nervous system exhaustion. "Report, Volkov." The brigade commander's voice sounded hollow, as if from behind a cotton wall. The colonel didn't raise his eyes from the map scribbled with red and blue arrows. Volkov licked his dry lips. His tongue seemed like sandpaper. Task of blocking the pass completed. Enemy movement stopped. 3 units of heavy armor type King Tiger destroyed. Crew casualties. 2 concussed. Driver-mechanic suffered torn ligaments in the hand while working levers. Material part. Gun requires barrel replacement. Rifling erosion is critical. Recoil mechanism overheated. Seals leaking. Ammunition expenditure, interrupted the chief of artillery, a dry old man with a corrosive gaze. 12 high-explosive fragmentation grenades. Armor-piercing shells were not used. Silence hung in the staff dugout. Pen scratching ceased. Officers raised their heads. 12 shells for 3 heavy tanks. That's an excellent result. But the phrase, armor-piercing were not used, sounded like absurdity. Like the raving of a madman. Against tigers? With HE shells? "Are you saying, Senior Lieutenant," slowly uttered the deputy political officer, standing up from the corner, "that you destroyed the newest German tanks having frontal armor of 150 millimeters with high explosive shells, without penetrating the armor?" "That is correct. Not a single through penetration." The deputy political officer narrowed his eyes. Suspicion read in them. For him, war was a matter of ideology and clear instructions. The instructions stated, "A tank is destroyed by an armor-piercing shell by hitting the crew or detonating ammunition." Shooting HE shells at tanks was considered a waste of ammunition, shooting at sparrows, bordering on sabotage. "That is impossible," the chief of staff cut off. "You can't fool physics, Volkov. An HE shell will just splash over the armor, scratch the paint, break the periscopes, but the tank will remain combat capable. Don't tell us fairy tales here. Maybe they just retreated and you wrote them down as destroyed? Falsification is a prosecutable offense." Volkov was silent. He had no strength to argue. How to explain to these people sitting in warmth what a hydrodynamic shock is? How to tell about the reflection of a blast wave from basalt? About how a 68-ton behemoth jumps like it's stung when 48 kilograms of TNT fly under its belly? It didn't fit into paragraphs of regulations. This was a different war. A war of engineers, not rule bookers. "Tanks destroyed irrevocably," Volkov repeated dully. "First, destruction of running gear and bottom. Crew died from barotrauma. Second, buried by rockfall. Third, tipped into the gorge. Road blocked by landslide. Germans retreated. Tipped? Re-asked the brigade commander, finally tearing himself away from the map. Volkov, are you out of your mind? With what did you tip it? Your shoulder? The situation was heating up. The deputy political officer had already opened a folder, preparing to write a report on professional incompetence, or worse, cowardice and attempt at deception. Volkov looked at them through a veil of fatigue. He didn't care. He did his job. He solved the problem. And how they would process it, that was their problem. The door to the basement threw open, letting in a cloud of cold steam. On the threshold stood the chief of reconnaissance. Behind him, a photographer with a wet bag. Permission to enter, Comrade Colonel. Photo control group returned. Film developed. Give it here. The brigade commander waved his hand. The scout laid out still damp black and white prints smelling of fixer onto the table. Glossy paper curled into tubes. Officers crowded around the table. First shot, close-up. King Tiger stands in the middle of the road, externally intact, but tracks are torn to shreds, road wheels turned inside out as if a giant chewed them. And under the bottom, black, scorched emptiness instead of asphalt. Hatches open, but no one came out. Dead machinery. Second shot. A pile of stones the height of a 2-story house. Only the muzzle brake of the gun with characteristic slots sticks out from under it. The barrel is bent in an arc. It is a grave. Third shot. The scariest.
Taken from the edge of the cliff. Far below, in the riverbed of a mountain river, lies a carcass turned tracks up. The turret lies separately, 10 meters away. The tank bottom, facing the sky, has a characteristic dent, as if struck by a giant fist from the inside. It became quiet in the headquarters again. But this was a different silence. Not skeptical, but stunned. The deputy political officer took the photo of the overturned tank, brought it to his eyes, then looked at Volkov. Suspicion disappeared from his gaze, replaced by something resembling superstitious horror. "How hard did you have to hit?" whispered the chief of artillery, wiping his glasses. "To flip such a behemoth. Upside down. It's physics, damn it." "Strength of materials," corrected Volkov. "And gas dynamics." The brigade commander looked at the photos for a long time. He was an old soldier. He went from Stalingrad to the Carpathians. He saw burnt fields and torn metal. But he hadn't seen this. This wasn't artillery work. It was surgical intervention in the landscape, using a heavy howitzer as a scalpel. He understood. He saw not just destroyed tanks, but the thought that led to this destruction. Cold, calculating, engineering thought. The colonel slowly walked around the table. He approached Volkov closely. The regiment commander smelled of expensive cologne and leather. This smell contrasted sharply with the smell of burning coming from the senior lieutenant. The brigade commander extended his hand. His palm was broad and warm. "I thought you were an artilleryman, Volkov," the colonel said quietly, looking straight into the officer's inflamed eyes. "But you, it turns out, are a professor." He firmly shook Volkov's hand. This handshake meant more than a medal. It was the recognition of a professional by a professional. 12 shells. The brigade commander shook his head. 3 heavy tanks. 0 penetrations. This needs to be put in textbooks. Not in tactics, but in the theory of destruction of materials. "I served the Soviet Union," Volkov answered hoarsely. "Write a recommendation," the brigade commander tossed to the chief of staff. "And not for courage. Write for the Red Banner, and issue alcohol to the crew, double ration, and sleep. Don't touch them for 24 hours. Comrade Colonel," Volkov swayed.
holding onto the edge of the table. "Permission to ask a question." "Speak, Professor." "Need to change the barrel. Rifling is almost gone. We won't pull through the next fight with such ballistics." The brigade commander grinned. In this grin was respect for a man who, barely standing on his feet from fatigue, thinks not about a reward and not about sleep, but about the geometry of the barrel. "You'll have your barrel, Volkov. I'll see to it personally. We'll take a new one from the repair base. Go." Volkov turned over his left shoulder, sharply, according to regulations, though his knees buckled. He walked out of the stuffy basement into the cold Carpathian night. Stars hung over the mountains, bright and cold like formulas in a physics textbook. Somewhere up there lay 3 iron monsters, defeated not by rage, but by reason. Now he could sleep. The equation was solved correctly. The answer matched reality. That battle on the Carpathian Pass did not become a period in the crew's biography, but it became a turning point in the philosophy of assault brigades. Our Su-152, having changed the worn-out barrel for a new one, continued its path to the west. It went through the mud of Balaton, where German tank divisions tried for the last time to break the back of history, and finished its march on the cobblestones of Vienna. In urban battles, where distances shrank to a grenade throw and the enemy hid behind thick walls of ancient buildings, the engineering approach of Guard Senior Lieutenant Volkov proved not just useful, it became the only way to survive. Volkov no longer sought duels. He stopped perceiving enemy equipment as an equal opponent. After the Carpathians, any tiger or panther turned for him simply into physical objects possessing mass, dimensions, and vulnerabilities that could and should be exploited. He learned to see the battlefield with the X-ray vision of an engineer. If the enemy hid around the corner of a house, Volkov didn't wait for him to stick out. He brought the building's facade down on the tank's roof with one HE shell fired into a load-bearing beam. If the German dug into the ground, leaving only the turret, Volkov hit the ground in front of the parapet, causing a landslide that blinded observation devices and jammed the turret. His method, which received the name undercut shooting or ricochet breach in narrow circles, was never officially recorded in combat regulations of that time. Army bureaucracy is a clumsy machine. It doesn't like improvisations requiring higher technical education. Writing in instructions, "shoot at the asphalt in front of the tank," would mean allowing thousands of inexperienced gunners to waste ammunition for nothing. This technique required not just courage, but an absolute, almost musical sense of shot physics. Therefore, Volkov's method was passed from mouth to mouth as secret knowledge, available only to old-timers and masters of fire. Evenings by bonfires, when engines were killed, mechanics and gunners drew diagrams on the ground with twigs, explaining to the young ones how a shockwave can look under the skirt of German cats. The war ended. The roar of cannonade was replaced by the silence of peaceful life, but Volkov did not go into the reserve. He changed his smoked coveralls for a military academy instructor's tunic. Years passed. Epochs changed. Tanks became different. Composite armor, reactive armor, laser rangefinders, and ballistic computers appeared. But in one of the lecture halls of the old academy building, time seemed to stand still. Here it smelled of chalk and cloth, not diesel and fumes. Windows looked out onto a quiet garden where lindens rustled, not exploding mortar shells. At the blackboard stood an elderly man with a face as if hewn from granite. His gray hair was cut short, and on his right hand, gripping a piece of chalk, old, whitened scars were visible, memory of a red-hot howitzer breach. Colonel Volkov was conducting a lecture on artillery tactics. Young cadets sat before him. They were different. They didn't know the smell of decomposing corpses. They didn't hear the grinding of tiger tracks coming for a ram. For them, war was theory, a paragraph in a textbook.
They looked at the old man with respect, but without the awe his soldiers felt in 44.
Volkov didn't tell them tales. He didn't like veteran prose with tears and pathos. He taught them to think. On the blackboard, he drew not heroic silhouettes with red stars, but dry vector diagrams. White chalk lines cut through the darkness of the board, showing meeting angles, pressure distribution diagrams, and shrapnel dispersion vectors.
Remember,
His voice, which had become quiet and creaky over the years, sounded distinct in the auditorium. An enemy tank is not a dragon that needs to be killed with a spear to the heart. It is an engineering construction, a set of steel sheets welded together. This construction has a yield strength. It has centers of mass. It has stress planes. He drew a schematic profile of a king tiger. Then he drew a ground line.
And then, with a sharp movement, he drew an arrow striking the ground in front of the tank and a fan of vectors going under the bottom. "You can have the most powerful cannon in the world," continued Volkov, looking into the cadet's eyes. "You can have shells with uranium cores, but if you have no head, you will lose. Caliber does not fight. Intellect fights. Your task is not just to shoot. Your task is to create conditions in which enemy equipment ceases to exist as a system." One of the cadets, an honor student from the front row, raised his hand. "Comrade Colonel, but modern tanks have anti-mine bottom protection. Is this method outdated?" Volkov smiled barely noticeably. Wrinkles gathered at the corners of his eyes. "Tanks become outdated, cadet. Instructions become outdated. Armor alloys change. But the laws of physics, they are eternal. Newton's second law worked at Austerlitz, worked at Kursk, and will work in any war of the future. Action equals reaction. Energy does not disappear anywhere. If you find a way to direct energy where the structure is not ready for it, you will win." He turned back to the board and drew a final line under the formula for calculating high explosive action. Chalk crumbled in his fingers, falling as white dust onto the sleeve of his tunic, exactly like Carpathian basalt once crumbled. "Don't look for head-on solutions," he said, addressing not so much the audience as himself, those shadows that remained on the mountain switchback. "A frontal attack is an admission of intellectual defeat. Look for a detour. Look for a ricochet. Use the environment. Stone, concrete, earth, all this is your weapon, if you know how to control it." The bell rang sharply, returning everyone to reality. Cadets made noise, gathering notes. Volkov put the chalk on the shelf. He wiped his hands with a handkerchief. In this gesture was a sense of completion. He passed the baton.
He gave them his experience, cleansed of blood and dirt, turned into pure crystalline logic. When the auditorium was almost empty, the last cadet lingered in the doorway. He looked at the diagram remaining on the board, at this strange, illogical, but deadly effective vector of strike from below. "Is the armor strong, Comrade Colonel?" he asked, recalling the words of a famous song. Volkov looked at the diagram. He remembered that moment when the 68-ton carcass jumped into the air, defeated by calculation. He remembered the face of his mechanic, remembered the silence after the battle. "The armor is strong, sons," answered the old engineer, and warmth sounded in his voice for the first time. "But physics, it is, you know, more stubborn than any Krupp steel. Study your materiel." He remained alone in the empty auditorium. The sun shone outside the window. The world was alive and complex, and on the board shone white the formula of the victory of human reason over brute force. Volkov took a rag
and slowly, unhurriedly, erased the drawing. The secret ceased to be a secret. Now it became science. And this was the main victory of Guards Senior Lieutenant Volkov, an engineer who proved that even in the hell of war, there is a place for cold, precise calculation.